So one thing we always are interested in when it comes to disease is what's the cause of any particular disease. The disease itself is really what's going wrong with the body, the symptoms and the signs, for example. And the etiology is trying to figure out the cause of any particular disease. Now, in this course, we study infectious disease, but diseases can have different causes, that some of which are not caused by infectious agents. For example, you can have somebody who inherits a gene mutation and has muscular dystrophy, for example, but that's not an infectious disease. It definitely has signs and symptoms, but it's not caused by an infection. There are degenerative diseases, some of which happen just because of old age, for example. But really, in this course, we're focusing on diseases that are caused by infectious agents. So bacteria, viruses, parasites, fungus, protozoans, etc. Now, you'll remember Koch's postulates had a very specific way to determine the etiology of an infectious disease. However, Koch's postulates are a little bit limited because, especially with virus, you can't just grow a virus outside of the host, which was one of the rules that Koch's postulates set out. In fact, you can't grow a virus outside the host. And so even Koch's postulates, they were very important at the time when he proposed them, but they're not absolutely usable today, based on what we know about things that are not simply just bacterial. So like I said, not all diseases are infectious. You have infectious diseases right here. Let me get a pen. Here's infectious disease. You have idiopathic diseases. You'll remember that idio means of unknown origin or unknown, and pathic is something abnormal. So an idiopathic disease would be something whose cause is unknown. Then you have the hereditary, congenital, some of those are like birth defects, degenerative, nutritional, diseases that come from maybe a deficiency of nutrients or vitamins, endocrine, mental disorders, immunological, cancerous, neoplastic, iatrogenic, and then nosocomial. Now, some of the nosocomial, those kind of overlap with infectious because a certain amount of diseases are what we call healthcare associated diseases, and sometimes it means things you get infected with because you're in a hospital or because you're in a healthcare situation. But anyway, there's a lot of diseases that are not caused by microbes, and that's the point. This group definitely is, and maybe some of these other things, but not every disease is caused by a microbe, so they're not all infectious type diseases. But in this course, that's all we really focus on. All right, so virulence factors. When you have a microorganism that causes disease, typically it has what we call virulence factors. Virulence refers to the aggressiveness or degree to which an agent causes disease. So degree of pathogenicity would be a way of saying how aggressive does it cause disease. So some things are more virulent than others. Some of the virulence factors, we already mentioned adhesion factors earlier in the previous lecture segment of this chapter. Biofilms, that's the tendency for organisms when they become in a community, they start to express genes that they normally wouldn't, and that makes them more aggressive. But the ones I'm going to focus on here are enzymes that are secreted, so extracellular enzymes, toxins, those are also secreted, and anything that causes the infectious agent to avoid phagocytosis. So anti-phagocytic factors. So in this image you see a list of microbes rated from more virulent to less virulent. You don't need to memorize the list, but the concept here is that some organisms are definitely cause a more aggressive infection and more aggressive disease, and plague definitely being aggressive. And then down here you have like a vaginal infection. It's virulent to a degree, but it's not aggressive, or it's not considered highly pathogenic. So what do we mean by virulence factors that are extracellular enzymes? So virulence factors are the things that make a microbe more or less virulent. And extracellular enzymes are sometimes called exoenzymes. They are secreted by the pathogen. Occasionally they're actually on the surface of the pathogen, but usually secreted. And it just causes damage in the host. So hyaluronidase, you've probably heard of hyaluronic acid. It's something that helps hold the skin tissue together. And hyaluronidase breaks it down. So that helps to break down the skin. And so a bacterium that secretes hyaluronidase is able to break down the connection between cells in the skin. And then another enzyme is collagenase, which breaks down collagen, which also holds together the skin. So these enzymes, which are secreted by bacteria, help to break through the barrier, which is the skin, and the barrier is very effective. But if the bacterium can get through the barrier, then it can get into the body. So you can see why any bacterium that secretes these enzymes would definitely be more pathogenic, more able to invade and cause disease. All right, so they help dissolve structures in the host to help the pathogen invade the body to create a good infection. There are mutant species that don't secrete the enzymes, and they are what we call avirulent. So A meaning not, virulent. So harmless strains are avirulent sometimes. Over here you have a bacterium that secretes coagulase. So some bacteria create this coagulase enzyme. And what it actually does is it creates a little clot, and it kind of hides the bacteria in a little clot that looks, to the body, it looks kind of normal, and then later the bacteria can release from the clot and go back into the blood, for example. So there's some interesting things that bacteria can do to aid in their virulence. Toxins. Toxins are similar to enzymes, exoenzymes, because they're secreted, or they're part of the pathogen structure. And like we said, tox means something like rotting, we said. No, septa was rotting. Tox was just poison. So toxemia would be having toxins in your bloodstream, because emia means bloodstream. And these are just things that cause a response. Sometimes they cause fever. Sometimes they cause death to some of the tissues. And here's a picture of an exotoxin. The bacterium is secreting this little red substance called cytotoxin, which is poisonous to the cells, and that causes damage of the tissues. And endotoxin would be something that is actually part of the cell itself. In this case, something called lipid A is on the surface of some bacterial types. And when those bacteria are digested by white blood cells, that toxin is released, and it causes some actually negative effects in the human body. And then anti-phagocytic factors. These are factors that prevent phagocytosis by the host's white blood cells, because white blood cells phagocytize anything that's not supposed to be in the body. And we'll learn more about this in the immunology chapters. But if let's say a bacterium has a capsule, then that can prevent that bacterium from being phagocytized. All right, and so that would allow that bacterium to have a sort of a protection from the host's defense. And there are some chemicals called leukocidins which are actually released by the bacteria. So this is like a toxin that's released by a bacterium and it kills the white blood cells. So there's a lot of interesting things that bacteria do to evade the immune response. Okay, there is a series of stages that an infectious disease will typically follow. And what's kind of interesting, this is following just one patient. And on the x-axis is time, and on the y-axis is, how much reproduction of the microorganism is happening inside the body. Or it can also represent how many signs and symptoms of the disease the patient has. So when the patient is contaminated and then infected, the infectious agent, it starts to replicate inside the body, but at first you don't know that you have it. And that period is called incubation. Now notice that there aren't any times on this x-axis because this can vary quite a bit depending on what disease you're looking at or what infectious agent you're looking at. So the incubation period goes for a certain amount. Oops. And then you go through what's called the prodromal period, where you start to feel a little off. So vague general symptoms, you're a little bit off. Now, a lot of times, guys, your body can start fighting off things. Sometimes your body will successfully fight something off right there, and then you'll feel better the next day, and you won't even get to the really bad illness. But let's say that the agent is successful and it's reproducing faster than your body can fight it, and you might go into the full-blown illness phase. So that's where you're going to have the most severe signs and symptoms that you're going to have. And then if your immune system hasn't kicked in by then it will start kicking in, and eventually you'll get better. That's the normal stages of an infectious disease that eventually resolves. Now, once you're on the other end here, once you're on the convalescent side, then you should have immunity the next time you get infected by the same agent. So sometimes you get the prodromal period and then you get better. And that would be, a lot of times that would be if your body has already had this disease before, or you might even go through the incubation period and never get any symptoms and get better. Now, sometimes in the incubation period, though, you don't feel bad, but you can be spreading this to someone else. That's possible. Usually right here at the peak is when the most spread. So if you feel sick and you go out of the house and cough and sneeze all over everybody, this is when you're typically, but there is a certain amount of contagiousness all the way up. So make sure you understand this graph. It represents one individual's path through and recovery from an infectious disease as a general concept. But the reason we didn't put any times on the x-axis is it varies quite a bit. If you have a staph, like food poisoning, foodborne infection, so that can be like a food poisoning, it'll be like less than a day incubation, and then really the whole bout of disease will go over in one day or so, if you've ever had food poisoning. The flu, about a full day of incubation, and then several days for each of the other phases, so you could be looking at a week for the entire process of disease. Cholera has 2 to 3 days of incubation. Herpes, about 5 days. You can see we're getting longer and longer on the incubation. Tetanus, 5 to 15 days. Syphilis, up to 21 days. Hepatitis could be up to 100 days. AIDS, you could be incubating AIDS for up to 8 years. Leprosy, up to 30 years. So that's why we don't put a time on the actual scale, because it just depends quite a bit which infectious agent you are infected with. Now, once you get the disease, then you are, at some point, you have the potential to be kind of spewing these agents, these infectious agents, out of your body. And it's really basically the same portals of entry become the portals of exit. So they can come out in your tears, in your nose secretions, in your mouth secretions, I guess in your earwax, although I've never heard of anybody really getting something from earwax, but I guess it's possible. A break in skin, and then feces, urine, any of the secretions of the genitalia, milk. And so fundamentally all of your portals of entry become potential portals of exit.